Today's PowerPoint is going to be about inequality, the criminal justice system in America, and how the criminal justice system wrongfully treats racial minorities in these low-income communities. My name is Jonathan Jimenez, and let's get into it. Minorities in America. When it comes to these low-income communities in America, there tends to be a prejudice when you think about the people who live there. And it's mostly African American and Hispanic demographic. And these people in these communities experience less than humane circumstances every day. They get treated differently as well. They tend to get less job opportunities than the average middle class or high class individual, even white. And it's mostly because of how they look or how they talk, how they were raised, where they're from. And the reason they're like that is because of the education that they receive in these communities compared to middle class and high class neighborhoods, and as well as the resources that these schools have. Now, it also has to do with the fact that these young individuals, when they're in school, they have either mental disorders, whether that is ADHD or they just have anger problems, or they're always getting into trouble. Their attention span isn't the best, and they really don't soak in all this knowledge that they're getting. So when they go into the real world, they don't know how to do interviews, and they don't know how to talk to someone professionally. They're a product of their environment, and that's what you see in most of these individuals, because in these neighborhoods is very rough. Mass incarceration. So mass incarceration has been going on since the 13th Amendment, and it's still going on to this day. The criminal justice system usually targets racial minority groups and low-income, high crime rate areas. And because of this, African Americans are incarcerated at 5.1 times the rate of white Americans. The reason for this being is racism in class is the driving issue when it comes to this problem in the criminal justice system, because it targets the poor and African American and Hispanic communities. Why? Because a lot of crime goes on in these areas, and it's easy to find people to arrest. The reason a lot of these racial minority groups are locked in prison for so long, and the reason there's 2.2 million prisoners behind bars, is because 1, mandatory minimum sentencing. 2, keeping public and private prisons full. You see, with private prisons, the government has to keep those prisons full, or they have to pay a fee. The government doesn't want to pay a fee, so they look for people to arrest to put in these private prisons. Jim Crow era. So the Jim Crow era started shortly after the 13th Amendment was passed. The Jim Crow era began in 1877 by the Supreme Court ruling. Now, the Jim Crow era did a few things. It segregated colored and whites, so they couldn't hang out. They couldn't both be sitting next to each other on the bus. They couldn't both go to the same restaurants. The colored people were actually also denied the right to vote. And according to America and to the law, colored were 2/3 of a white person. So basically, they had 2/3 of the rights that a white person was able to have. Now, not only while the Jim Crow era was going on, there was also illegal acts of crime happening against these colored people by whites. Things like lynchings, beatings, and harassment to colored people from whites. The Ku Klux Klan was around at this time as well, and colored were continuously being harassed, and they were continuously unsafe in America all over the place in this time. The war on drugs, which was created by Richard Nixon in June 1971, was created because of crack cocaine, which was becoming prevalent at the time, and it was heavily used in the low-income, high-crime rate areas, communities. It was a cheap substitute for cocaine. Cocaine was being used within the middle class mostly, and mostly at parties and events. Crack back then was considered 100 to 1 when compared to cocaine if arrested. So basically, what that meant was that if someone was caught with 1 gram of crack, they would, and let's say they would be sentenced to 5 years or 1 year per gram. Someone who was caught with cocaine, let's say 100 grams of cocaine, would get 1 year. So basically, a truckload of cocaine, if caught, you would get 1 year. And if I found one gram of crack in your pocket, you would get 1 year, which already sounds ridiculous. I bet it sounded ridiculous back then as well. It also damaged the low-income minority communities the most because that's where crack was being used the most, sold the most. And Richard Nixon cracked down mostly on low-income communities, which took away fathers, mothers, family members from children. And now those children are grown up. Today, they're grown up and they have kids. And now those kids only know what their parents know. Just like those parents only knew what their parents knew around the time of the war on drugs. So now it's a cycle in these low-income communities to have only one parent in a household. And that's because a lot of the people who were arrested at the time of this going on is actually still in prison or just got out a few years ago because they were getting 20 years, 30 years. And around the time of the war on drugs, what was heavily being used was stop and frisk. And it still is used today, especially in New York City. It was created for police officers to have more flexibility, to use their professional instinct. So when they thought they saw someone that was suspicious and they had probable cause, they would be able to stop this individual and pat him down over his clothes. And let's say they stopped you because they thought you were carrying a gun. Or let's say they stopped you because they thought you were carrying drugs. And let's say they checked you and they found 1 gram of crack. You would be arrested. Not because they saw the crack cocaine or because they saw a gun, but because they saw you as an individual, and because of the way you dressed, especially in these low-income communities. They see an African American sagging his pants, talking with his friends. He looks like a bad person, right? So a lot of times they would be stopped and they would be checked, and if you did have something, you'd be taken. This was created in 1968 during the Terry v. Ohio Supreme Court case, and yeah, it's still being used today. Now, prisoner reentry. So basically, this is when it's a reentry program. So when prisoners leave in prison, they'll get reintegrated with society, little by little. But there's a lot of side effects to this. A lot of things that affect these prisoners on the outside because of what happened in the inside. Some prisoners become depressed because of the lack of job opportunity, and the life that they have is so different when they're out. They don't have the same opportunities. They're not treated the same. They had to put on their resumes and on questionnaires that they used to be in prison, and a lot of times that takes away opportunities that they would have had if they weren't in prison at all. And this is a lot of times called the property of the state. So basically, after you get arrested, even when you're outside and you leave, you're still being treated as if you did something wrong. So let's say 20 years down the line, you're 40 years old, but you got arrested when you were 20. Someone sees on your resume that you used to be in prison, or on a questionnaire when you answer it, you used to be in prison. They'll still treat you as if you were the same person. Now, another thing that happens too is a lot of young prisoners who get arrested around their teenage years, they especially in New York, I know heavily, they use solitary confinement. on these young individuals, and they spend months at a time sometimes in solitary confinement with almost no room to do anything for 23 hours, and then they have 1 hour outside or to do some sort of activity. And over time, because their brains are still developing, they they get mental disorders, which hurts them when they're released. So they'll have even worse anger problems, or they'll be a little slower than the average person. It'll take them a longer time to analyze the situation, or they'll have speech problems because they really don't talk to anyone. Um, Another issue too is the recidivism rate is high, and this is all over America, because a lot of times what they do to you in prison and these correctional facilities, they 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 make you pay for the crime when you're inside, I should say, instead of trying to reintegrate you into society, so when you are released you're ready to be there. They punish you instead of um instead of trying to rehabilitate you. Another thing too is the suicide rate. A lot of prisoners do commit suicide because of all these things that I said. Sometimes some prisoners have all of these things in one, and it's hard to get over what happened to you in the correctional facilities, prisons, jails. It's a lot to take in. Things and alternatives, personally, that I think would help, and what I've researched is shrinking the prison population. So, like I said, during mass incarceration, a lot of private prisons, especially, governments have to keep them fully booked up. They have to have every bed filled, or they have to pay a fee. So what they do is they go on the streets and find any small crime to try to arrest you, or to try and convict, especially racial minority groups, into prison, because they don't want to pay. They don't want to pay these private prisons. And they don't want to lose money in public prisons, because it makes a lot of money too. Another solution would be allowing prisoners who were on good behavior free. So let's say prisoners who earned a few certificates, or got some sort of education, has been on a few years of good behavior. If they seem like they'll be good on the outside and they shouldn't be there any longer, there should be some way to reduce their time there, and let them go free, even if it's under watch, or another year in house arrest but at home, and then let them go, or but just something less harsh, because if I feel like if they're showing you that they shouldn't be there anymore, they shouldn't be there. uh Another solution alternative would be eliminating incarceration for people who are first time offenders, for, let's say, crimes that are like doing graffiti, or robbing a store, or assault. Let's say, like, a minimal assault, like a fight with your brother, or like something like that. um I feel like I feel like they should be given a second chance to show that they're better than that. Even if the law says that you have to do a year or 2 years, I feel like everyone deserves a second chance before they're actually judged as who they're gonna be the rest of their lives. Because once you go to prison, that's who you are forever. In a lot of people's eyes, you can't change. Even though I believe that's not true, many people believe that's not true as well. I feel like if you do those three things, if you don't try to force people, citizens, into those beds in prison to save money, and yes, you're gonna lose money, but I feel like you should put that money into giving bigger funding to drug treatment programs and alternatives to incarceration. So basically, what I mean by that is, like, um, instead of, like I said, with low level crimes, instead of putting them in jail, you should make them do 1 year of community service, and, like, let's say 6 months of school or something like that. Whatever it has to be, I feel like you should put more money into rehabilitating these individuals, instead of making them pay for what they've done. Um, Another thing too, which is a big one for me, is eliminate three strikes law. So if someone steals and goes to jail for 6 months, someone steals again, goes to jail for 6 months, and let's say again they rob someone for the third time, but let's say 20 years later, and they did it for reasons that no one will know about. Like, for example, they have to feed their kid, but they have no money. But they're still getting arrested, and now they're going to jail for life. Why? Because it's your third time being arrested, even though you got arrested twice when you were 18, and now the third time you got arrested, you were 40 years old. So I feel like every single case should be on its own merit, and it shouldn't be all tied into one. Those are my solutions and alternatives. And yeah, this is my presentation on inequality in the criminal justice system in America. My name is Jonathan Jimenez again, and thank you for listening.